During my teenage years, my closest friends were Julieta, Camilla, Natalia, and myself. We were inseparable, spending nearly every moment together, whether at school or outside of it. We studied in groups, hung out, and most importantly, gathered at Julieta's house, the central meeting spot for all of us. Julieta lived with her mother, sister, niece, and grandmother in a three-story house. Her family occupied the second floor, while the first floor was rented out, and the third served as a terrace. One morning during recess, Julieta urgently called us together. Her face was pale, her expression a mix of concern and something deeper, fear. We sat in a circle on the school's grassy area, and she began speaking in a hushed tone, as if afraid someone might overhear. For the past few nights, something strange has been happening to me. We exchanged uneasy glances, waiting for her to continue. Julieta explained that she hadn't been able to sleep. She would lie awake in her room, tossing and turning, unable to rest. One night, driven by thirst, she left her room and went to the dining room, where her family kept a small refrigerator with cold drinks. The house was silent. Not wanting to wake anyone, she moved carefully. She opened the fridge, grabbed her water bottle, and began drinking, standing right in front of it. Then she saw it. From the corner of her eye, in the dimly lit living room, something caught her attention. Under the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the window, she saw a white, motionless figure. Slowly, she turned her head, and there it was. A few meters away, in the middle of the living room, stood a little girl. She was small, no more than a meter tall, wearing light-colored pajamas, white with pink details. Her long hair was tied in a messy braid, strands stuck to her forehead as if she had been sweating. Julieta froze. Her eyes met the girl's for a few seconds, but that was enough. A primal fear gripped her, the kind of terror that paralyzes you. Without thinking, she dropped the bottle, letting the water spill onto the floor, and bolted back to her room. She slammed the door shut and hid under her blankets as if they could protect her from what she had just seen. She waited. Nothing. No one in the house woke up from the noise, not her mother, not her grandmother, not her sister. The house remained in absolute silence. The next morning, she tried to convince herself it had been her imagination, that her niece, the only child in the house, had gotten up at night, and she had mistaken her for something else. But doubt gnawed at her. When everyone was awake, Julieta asked her sister about her niece's white and pink pajamas. "What pajamas?" Her sister frowned. She pulled out the only pajamas in those colors her daughter owned. They weren't the same. The pajamas Julieta had seen were a short-sleeved nightgown with pink details. Her niece's were a long-sleeved set, bright pink with white edges and a bear design. A chill ran down Julieta's spine. It couldn't have been her niece. So what had she seen that night? We fell silent, a shiver running through us as Julieta finished her story. Natalia, wide-eyed and trembling, scolded her for not telling her family sooner. Camilla, ever practical, asked if anything else had happened. Julieta hesitated, then nodded. Since that night, she whispered, "I haven't gone into the living room after dark. Not alone, not with anyone. But 2 nights ago." She paused, her breathing heavy, as if reliving the moment. "I couldn't hold it anymore. I had to go to the bathroom." She took a deep breath. The bathroom is right next to the living room, and there's a small window that connects the hallway to the living room. From there, you can see everything. We shuddered. The idea of passing through that area was terrifying, but Julieta had no choice. "I walked in complete silence," she continued, "with my bedroom light on, leaving the door open, in case I had to run back. I closed my eyes almost completely. I didn't want to see. I didn't want to feel. I didn't want to know." She paused, swallowing hard. "I made it to the bathroom, and I was safe. But the worst was yet to come. When I finished, as I washed my hands, my mind was already on the way out. On the window. I didn't want to look. I shouldn't look." She took our hands. Her skin was cold. I took a step toward the door, and I heard it. Her voice cracked. It was a subtle sound, but clear, like someone lightly scraping glass with their nails. Like an insistent tapping. We shivered. I don't know when I did it, but I looked. Yulita lowered her head into her hands. She was there. The image she described made us hold our breath. The girl had her face and hands pressed against the glass. Her pale skin was flattened against it. Her eyes were so close to the glass that they looked viscous. And her fingers, Yulita murmured, her fingers drummed against the window. Over and over again. There was a long silence. She looked at us with an indescribable expression. The worst part was that I swear she smiled at me. Her voice trembled. I don't know how I got to my room, but when I shut the door, when I hid under the covers, that smile was in my mind. She looked at us again, her expression haunted. I felt mocked, she whispered, as if I had fallen into a trap, as if that thing knew something I didn't. A knot of tension formed between us. Even Camilla, the bravest of us, had lost her confident demeanor. I was caught between fear and fascination. I couldn't say I wasn't scared, but the fact that I wasn't experiencing it firsthand allowed me to maintain a fragile composure. Still, what unsettled me most wasn't the story itself, but Yulita's endurance. How had she managed to bear all of this without telling her family? How could she continue living in that house with that presence lurking in the shadows? Recess ended, and we returned to class, our minds still trapped in what we had just heard. We had 4 long hours before we could go home, but the sense of unease never left us. Every now and then, our eyes met, sharing a silence filled with unanswered questions. Days passed, and in our project methodology class, we were assigned the task of developing the theoretical framework for our graduation research. As usual, we agreed to meet at Yulita's house to work on it that afternoon. After school, we stopped to buy snacks, trying to convince ourselves it would be just another ordinary afternoon. When we arrived at Yulita's house, her grandmother greeted us warmly. She had known us for years and welcomed us as if we were her own grandchildren. We moved to the dining table, chatting about trivial things. That's when I noticed it. Yulita had a distant look, her eyes fixed on the living room, on the very spot where she had seen the girl. I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. She blinked and turned to me, her expression a mixture of gratitude and distress. It was at that moment that a chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, I became aware of where we were, of the walls surrounding us, of the door leading to the living room, of Yulita's story and the presence that inhabited that house. I swallowed hard and turned my gaze back to my plate, trying to push away the dark thoughts creeping into my mind. We finished lunch, washed our dishes, and headed to Yulita's room. There, we settled around her desk, ready to focus on our research. However, the feeling of unease lingered. Yulita's grandmother knocked on the door to tell us she was going to pick up Yulita's niece from school and would be back soon. As soon as she left, the awareness of our solitude settled over us like a heavy shadow. The house was empty. There was no one else. We exchanged glances, and Camilla broke the silence with a sensible warning. We needed to focus. We tried, and for a while, it worked. More than half an hour of peace passed before something shattered that fragile balance. A faint tapping, weak but clear, coming from the bedroom window. We turned our heads in unison toward the sound and then looked at Yulita. She frowned and, in a firm voice, asked Camilla to accompany her. Camilla pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. There was nothing there. But the silence that followed was no relief. Suddenly, louder, more insistent knocks. This time from the adjacent wall. Who sleeps there? I asked. Yulita looked at me grimly. No one. That room is empty. My dad only uses it when he visits, but that hardly ever happens. Camilla grew restless and decided to check. She stepped out and left the door slightly ajar. The seconds stretched endlessly until she returned, looking confused. There's no one, she said. I checked the other room, and it's empty. So is Yulita's niece's room. No one. As she spoke, Yulita noticed something behind her. The door leading to the living room, which had been closed before, was now slightly open. In the gap, a shadow. It had no defined shape, but it was 2 colors, black and white. Yulita pulled out her phone, switched to video mode, and zoomed in. We huddled behind her, watching the screen intently. And then the shadow moved. Just a slight shift, but enough to make the door move with it. Natalia let out a strangled gasp and panic erupted. We all screamed except for Camilla, who ran to the bedroom door and slammed it shut. When she turned to face us, she found us all huddled together on Julieta's bed. "Calm down," she ordered firmly. But before she could say anything else, the knocks resumed, this time on both the window and the adjacent wall simultaneously. It could no longer be a prank. It was impossible for someone to be in two places at once. It was impossible, at least for a human being. Natalia broke into sobs. I wanted to get out of here. I glanced at my phone. It was 5 in the afternoon. I had to leave too, but the thought of stepping out of that room paralyzed me. We decided to stop working and turn on the TV for distraction. No one spoke. No one moved. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. A knock at the door made us jump, but this time it was Julieta's grandmother. She peeked in with a warm smile. "I'm back, girls. I brought fresh fruit for you." Behind her, Julieta's niece clung timidly to her skirt. She greeted us sweetly and ran into Julieta's arms. "Did you just get here?" Julieta asked. "Yes," the little girl replied. "Grandma bought me ice cream on the way, so we took a little longer." We looked at each other, our hearts pounding. There had been no one in the house. No one. But something. Something had been with us the whole time. With Julieta's family home, the air in the room felt lighter, but the tension didn't fully dissipate. Julieta, feeling a renewed sense of security, finally stepped out of the room. Natalia, however, was still trembling. Her fear was palpable, and her tear-filled eyes reflected a primal urgency. She wanted to run. "I'm not staying here any longer," she whispered shakily, staring at the door as if expecting something to appear at any moment. Jamila and I tried to calm her down. We told her it would be rude to leave abruptly, especially when Julieta's grandmother had taken the trouble to prepare something for us. But Natalia insisted. She clung to the sleeve of my sweater like a terrified child, and the trembling in her hand sent shivers down my spine. Eventually, we convinced her to stay, at least until we finished our snack. The grandmother returned with plates of fresh fruit and juice. The sound of utensils scraping against the dishes broke the uneasy silence, but it wasn't enough to ease our thoughts. Everything that had happened was still imprinted in our minds with terrifying clarity. Each bite felt heavy, as if our throats refused to swallow. I was the first to speak. "Julieta, you have to tell them what's happening. You can't keep this to yourself." She immediately shook her head, pressing her lips together. "I don't want to scare my mom or my grandma," she murmured, staring at her plate. Something inside me ignited. "And what if it happens again tonight?" I said, not sugarcoating my words. "We'll go home and sleep soundly, but you'll stay here alone with that. Do you really want to keep ignoring it?" Julieta glared at me, but her eyes welled up with tears. She knew I was right. Her stubbornness was only condemning her to face whatever lurked in that house alone. Finally, she sighed and, in a trembling voice, whispered, "Okay. Tonight, when my mom gets home, I'll tell him everything." We finished eating in heavy silence, as if the house itself was listening to every word. We washed the dishes and said goodbye with tense smiles. Before leaving, we insisted, "If anything happens, anything at all, call us." She nodded with a tired smile, but her eyes reflected something deeper: fear, resignation. We walked away from the house, feeling like we were leaving something behind. The last thing we saw of Julieta was her silhouette in the doorway, watching us as we left. And then the door closed. Behind us, the house loomed, silent and shadowy, like a patient predator. That night, when I got home, the darkness in my room felt thicker than usual. I locked my door, as if that could keep out the feeling that something, from some unseen corner, was watching me. I told everything to my mother and my aunt. They, being deeply religious, crossed themselves several times as they listened, their faces reflecting a mixture of disbelief and fear. In my mind, the doubt lingered: should I show them the video Julieta had managed to record in her house? The video of that thing? I took a moment alone to review it. Julieta had sent it to our WhatsApp group, But until that moment, I hadn't had the courage to examine it closely. I turned up the screen brightness, but the image remained dark, distorted. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't want to watch it, but I couldn't look away either. So I used an app to adjust the contrast and saturation. I tweaked the colors, the shadow levels, and suddenly, there it was. I dropped the phone as if it had burned my fingers. The screen had revealed what was once hidden in the darkness. A gray face with features that might have seemed feminine, but weren't human. Not entirely. The withered skin, deeply wrinkled on the forehead and around the eyes of a bluish-gray hue that seemed to sink into the very darkness. And that smile, it was the same one Julieta had seen that night. The smile that had paralyzed her, the one that stretched too far, too wide. As if that thing's lips were about to tear apart. It was not a child. It was not human. A disguise, a crude attempt to appear harmless, but in its imperfection, it revealed its true nature. Trembling, I sent the modified video to the group. Look closely. Tell me you see it. The blue ticks appeared almost immediately. Messages from Natalia and Camilla flooded the conversation. What the hell is that? Oh my God. They can't be real. But Julieta didn't reply. Not that night, nor in the days that followed. She wasn't online, or maybe she had decided to distance herself from all of this, as if ignoring it would make it disappear. I took my phone and went to my mother. First, I showed her the original video, the one Julieta had recorded without modifications. She barely watched a few seconds before looking away, her expression twisting into a grimace of horror. Delete that right now, she demanded with a trembling voice. They could bring bad things into this house. You shouldn't have seen it or kept it. Without arguing, I deleted it in front of her. But a thought pulsed in my mind. The modified video, I hadn't shown that one yet. That night, I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, she appeared again. Her face twisted in my mind, her smile stretching wider and wider, turning into a grotesque grimace, an aberration of the human form. I would jolt awake, gasping, feeling the cold sweat cling to my skin. I lay still, staring at the ceiling for hours, my phone beside me, the temptation to watch the video growing inside me like poison. My mother was right. I shouldn't keep this up. On the third night, I deleted it. I can't say if I slept better after that, but at least I no longer had the excuse to open my gallery and relive it. The video was gone, lost in space and time, but not from my memory. 11 years have passed since that night. I'm 26 now, and I still remember it with terrifying clarity, especially because I know what happened next, in Julieta's house.